are here today to talk a little bit about Civil War oddities and similarities between what was happening then to now and how things are the same and different. I have Professor Dave Miller here with us. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. I'm happy to. Anytime someone invites me to come talk about the Civil War, I drop everything that I'm doing and I come talk about the Civil War.
I appreciate that. So right now you're a professor at UCSD, that's correct?
USD, yes, right. I was at UCSD for grad school. Now I'm at USD. There's a lot of U's and C's in the area.
Got it. And your main focus is Civil War.
Right. U.S. history, 19th century, but I teach Civil War class, different versions. I have a regular Civil War in popular culture, which basically just means we watch Civil War movies, talk about what they mean. It's fun.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
That is really fun. I bet a lot of people like to take your class.
I think so. They're usually full, so I'll just assume it's because I'm great.
I would attest to that for sure.
There you go. No, it's the Civil War. Everyone loves the Civil War. And most people, they know something about it in ways that they don't know about other parts of history. Like you don't have like Great Depression buffs or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. But Civil War buffs for sure.
Right.
So what got you so interested in the Civil War?
That's a great question. I don't know. I've just always been interested in it. My mom taught history, and as a kid, I had a little Civil War kids book, and I've just always just been very, very interested. It's something that's always fascinated me. That's sort of the reasonable explanation. The other is that I'm reincarnated. So I don't know which it is.
Well, that works too. And I'm interested in history as well. And I think it might be in a different way than most people are. But, you know, we've talked about this, that I like to learn history through odd things that happen in history, or I like to visit grave sites and read how people died and what pandemics were and epidemics were, you know, in the past, because that really tells a lot about the future and where we're going. Like we were saying, you know, think about Prohibition, right? 13 years you couldn't go into a bar or restaurant and have a drink.
That's right.
And here we were ripping our hair out because we're like, I haven't been out of the house in 2 months, but you can
13 weeks. Yeah.
You can still smoke. You can still carry on with life.
Right. You can have it delivered to your house. You're fine.
Have it delivered to your house. You can even go and pick it up now in California, tap on it and bring it home if you need a margarita.
Right.
13 years.
Yeah, it's a long time. It's funny. Before this all started, I used to kind of think, well, World War II in the U.S. was only 3.5 years on the home front. Like, how hard could that be? And now I'm like 3 months into this thinking, can't imagine 3 years with like no butter and nylons and bars.
Nylons? That's weird.
I mean, not for me, but I'm just saying, you know, for people.
It could be. No judging.
Remember. Yeah.
I like all your books.
Hey, thanks. Yeah. There's I got a few of them. It's This is the affectionately known as the Lincoln Room. There's a lot of Lincoln memorabilia in here. This is where all the history magic happens. It's the history factory. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us something about Lincoln that most people wouldn't know?
Oh, okay. One of my favorite bits about him is that I always ask people, do you know what Abraham Lincoln's middle name was?
No.
And you don't, because he didn't have one.
Well, wouldn't that be odd for that time? I mean, people...
No, actually, I think it's actually a little stranger that he didn't. It was, or even, you know, multiple names or combination of names. People were oftentimes named after people, so they had weird long names. But yeah, just Abraham Lincoln, no middle name. And he was also our first president with a beard. That's exciting.
You know what else I read recently? That he was actually shot before he was killed. He was on a horse, I was reading, and but they like kept it under wraps. Do you know about this? I actually
I need to go read a book back here. I'm not sure I knew about that. I know that there were attempts on his life, and he was receiving threats, and he had dreams about his own death. He had bodyguards, sort of what we now call the Secret Service developed with the Pinkerton Agency that were his personal bodyguards. But yeah, there were, and John Wilkes Booth was multiple times sort of in his proximity, but never actually. So
do you want me to school you on this? I actually, I I screenshotted it in my phone because I thought it was really interesting. This comes
Okay. Yeah.
from history.com, so it's a reliable source.
Yeah.
Lincoln was shot at and almost killed nearly 2 years before he was assassinated.
Oh, wait, hold on. Is this outside Washington, D.C. when he was out visiting the troops?
No.
Oh, okay. Go on.
No. Late one August evening in 1863, after an exhausting day at the White House, Lincoln rode alone by horse to the soldier's home, his family's summer residence. A private at the gate heard a shot ring out, and moments later, the horse galloped into the compound with a bareheaded Lincoln clinging to his steed. Lincoln explained that the gunshot had gone off at the foot of the hill, sending the horse galloping so fast it knocked his hat off. Two soldiers retrieved Lincoln's hat, which had a bullet hole right through it. The president asked the guards to keep the incident under wraps. He didn't want his wife to worry.
Wow, he didn't want me to know either. So that was well done. Well, all right. Well done.
I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. Look at that.
No middle name, and there was assassination attempt on him 2 years before this, actually.
There you go. There you go.
So tell me.
Yeah, what do you want to know about the Civil War?
We're looking at around 700,000 dead.
Yes. So one of the things that I've been thinking about with the Civil War and this current pandemic is, unfortunately, death. And it's something that both have in common. You know, we're surrounded by disease, by health issues, by death. And so in the American Civil War, the traditional number is 650,000. But recent studies have recalculated that it's probably closer to 750,000. And then there are about 50,000 civilian deaths. So by any measure, it's still the bloodiest war in U.S. history. It's more deaths than all other U.S. wars combined. It's nowhere near where we're at right now, but I did a little math and I looked because I was curious. The number of deaths per day in the Civil War averaged just under 500. If you take that 700 number and divide it by 4 years, so just in terms of a daily count, we're actually much, much higher. Because what are we now? Like some people are saying around 2,000 a day. So this right now is greater than sort of the average that we would have seen over the Civil War. So it's pretty nasty. And just like now we're really preoccupied with that issue, that's what they would have been preoccupied with during the war, because death, I mean, it touched every American and they just weren't accustomed to it. And so it changed a lot of the ways that people dealt with death. It's like socially and culturally, but also actually physically how you took care of dead soldiers.
And I understand a lot of the deaths were from disease and viruses and things like that too. It wasn't actually from combat.
Right. So one of the first problems was that for the first time in American history, you take all these people from around the country and bring them all together in these massive army camps. And so people began spreading childhood diseases. Then, of course, you have the issue, right, because you hadn't been exposed. You live on a farm off by yourself in nowhere, Wisconsin. All of a sudden, you're in a camp with 100,000 people. And so there's this initial spreading of disease. Then you have the arrival of prostitutes who are there to perform an economic service for the military. Their patriotic duty, and the soldiers are more than happy to. And so then you have an epidemic of venereal disease. Then you have the problem of dysentery, which is just a fancy way of saying diarrhea. And then on top of all that, you have battlefield wounds that they couldn't really clean out. There was no such thing as penicillin. And so soldiers died of their wounds, not because they were shot, because they got infected. So more Americans died of disease than actual battlefield deaths.
Wow. And I think there's something interesting too about the prostitutes themselves, right? There are certain calibers of prostitutes because there are ones that were, considered clean, or if you had a disease, then you got hooked up with the prostitute that also had that disease because they're just giving it back and forth to each other.
So it's crazy. It was a problem. No, so it's a problem that all armies have dealt with. Is men move through war and women follow to be prostitutes. And so the U.S. Civil War is no different. And what happened was in Nashville, in Tennessee, the Union Army occupied the city and was there for a long time. And so there were a lot of prostitutes. There was a whole red light district, and that created all this disease. And so actually the Union Army tried to clean it up by putting all the prostitutes onto a ship, which I think, and this is not a joke, was called the Idaho, which I think is just an ironic joke in history that all the prostitutes were on the Idaho. But anyway,
Oh,
true. It's a true story. It's a true story.
Idaho.
And exactly. And so they sent them, they're like, go somewhere else. And so the boat is like going up and down the river trying to find places to go, but no city will let this boat of prostitutes in. So they go back to Nashville, and the general in charge says, you know what we need to do is we just need to legalize prostitution. And so they legalize it and set up separate hospitals and camps for infected people, infected soldiers, and infected prostitutes. And then you had to register and get a license to practice. And that showed that you were clean and registered and licensed. And so, yeah, they didn't have modern medicine, but they did have quarantine, separation. They had regulation and licensing, and that cut the venereal disease rates down dramatically. And it was a short-lived experiment in legalized prostitution.
Wow. And again, so we're saying that things that are relative to today that are part of our past, and that's something that they're, considering. I don't think it's ever going to pass, but giving a certificate that says, whether you have the antibodies or that you've had COVID-19, or that they're kind of talking about the same thing.
Right. Yeah. So I like to think of it as, we like to think like, how does history sort of get us to where we are today? And it's kind of a long ways away for the Civil War to make that direct comparison. But if you look backwards, exactly, there are lessons from the past that help us kind of understand it maybe a little bit better and where we're at. And I think that's absolutely true. If you can get that antibody test, and it's so important to know who has it, who doesn't, and then they can go function in society in different roles. So you're cleared to go back to work, or you're cleared to go back into the classroom or whatever. And so there's almost this economic incentive to have testing. It's not just a public health issue, it's a market issue. And that's exactly what happened with prostitutes. And that's what they're looking at now. There's also a downside, though. The downside was with disease in the 19th century, things like yellow fever. Yellow fever it killed at least 150,000, probably more than that, people throughout the South in the first half of the 19th century. And
what happens to you if you have yellow fever?
It's also, my understanding is it's also a flu virus, and it is transmitted by mosquitoes. And you get very, very, I'm not sure if it's respiratory, but you're coughing up blood, you have fever. It's a terrible death. It's not good. And so what would happen is some people, survived it and became immune, and then they were able to be employed. And so in the South, where you already have a hierarchy by race and by class and all that stuff, you have immigrants who are coming in, and they would basically go to these yellow fever parties, which sounds like a fun party, but a yellow fever party. And if they died, they died. But if they survived, they could then again present and say, hey, I've had the disease, I passed, you're safe, you can hire me to work. The problem is this allows the rich people to stay isolated in their little homes and stay quarantined and not have to be out there and be affected by it. So it further divided society. And to say nothing of slaves, who of course were affected by it the worst.
But was it the same? So it was the same direction for the slaves too? They were also infected by this. So were they now doing jobs that normally they wouldn't do because they could be out in the public knowing that they...
Yes. So one of the fundamental characteristics of American slavery that makes it different than other forms is that by definition, you're a legal piece of property, which means you have a value. You have a labor value of what you produce, and you have a capital value of what you can be bought or sold for. And so your capital value increased with various ratings, how old you are, how big you are, can you have children, that kind of thing. But it also would increase if you had already had the disease, because you are now able to take that enslaved person and put them to work in ways that you couldn't do with non-enslaved people. Mm-hmm. So basically immunity meant a different kind of nature of slavery for the enslaved, but it literally was capital in the back pockets of the slave owners because they now had more valuable property.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword. This can be a dangerous thing to start sort of dividing society by, who's clean and who's not and what that all means.
I absolutely agree with that. So we're going kind of back to death and how the Civil War changed the way that we think about it. Mm-hmm. I know that it also changed the way that we deal with our dead as well. Mm-hmm. We were talking about embalming, and mm-hmm. that was something that was created during the Civil War, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah. So one of the Civil War is happening at a time when the United States is changing. There's more factory production and you're able to mass produce goods, and there's all these inventions and things. It's a very lively time. And so there are a lot of things that are invented during the Civil War. And one of those is really the modern embalming industry. Because what happened is it's still a time when death was very present in people's lives. Today, we kind of, certainly as Americans, we kind of separate ourselves from old age and dying, either in hospitals or old folks' homes. But back in the 19th century, that happened at the home. And so there was a proper ritual, a practice that happened, especially for Christians. And so the problem with the Civil War is now you've taken people and you've sent them off somewhere in the middle of nowhere to some battlefield where they just die anonymously. They can't be properly mourned. They can't have a Christian burial. And that's a real fear for the families and for the soldiers, who then pay a lot of money to the other group of people who are following army camps, and that is embalmers, who basically make a business out of recovering the dead from the field, preserving their bodies, and then shipping them home so they can go through that death ritual.
And this is around the time that they started sewing the names on their uniforms.
Yes. So you don't have dog tags like we have now to collect and to keep track. And so oftentimes before a big battle, the famous story is the Battle of Cold Harbor, which is part of the Wilderness Campaign, where there was just thousands of casualties every day, and soldiers kind of accepted that they were probably going to die. And so they began sewing their names and hometowns into their uniforms, knowing that if they fell, that somebody would eventually find them and be able to identify them and send them home. It's great. I mean, it's very morbid stuff, but it's fascinating how, at least for me, probably for you too, because you brought it up, how society has to handle the reality of anonymous death. And not to get really dark, but that's kind of what's happening now. Is this disease is such that you can't go in and be with your loved one when they pass away. You can't have a funeral service. And so like now we're like, oh, we could do it online, or we can, get the iPad out with the nurse for our last goodbyes. And it's sort of like we have to improvise because the nature of the death is totally alien to what we're used to. And that disrupts our sort of normal cultural processes.
Yeah, it is a bit odd, and not being able to congregate for a funeral, right, and that kind of thing. Right. So back then when they back to the embalming. What did they use back then to embalm the bodies? Is it similar to what they use today?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think different embalmers had different chemicals. Some were better than others. Sort of like the medicine salesman, so they would go around, and some were, selling mercury or, things that today you might consider poison. But they're chemists. There was a new photography industry. So people were experimenting with different kinds of chemicals, basically just trying to find ways. But the actual process of pumping the body with fluids to preserve it, that is happening on the battlefield. And so you actually had these wagons with all the machinery that they could use to embalm people and then send them home.
Just right straight there on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Maybe they pull them off.
Pull them off, put them up. There's a big tent, right? But of course it was for a fee. So it's not the government that was doing this. It was all private. So you would then, you would pay someone to go out and do that and find your loved one and send them home.
Oh, so it's the family that pays these people to find their loved ones. So I was like, well, right, if you're dead, how are you going to ask the embalming people?
Right. Right. I guess you could have like a little sign. It's like, embalm me.
with like the money in the little pocket or whatever.
Yeah.
Take it.
Hook it up before you go out, and then like if you fall. But yeah, no, I mean, it's terrible, but it also did force the government to think about things differently. So things that today we do take for granted, like for example, for veterans, if you die, you get special benefits, or your family does, pensions, war records, all that kind of stuff. The federal government kind of had to make up and create a bureaucracy to do because it didn't exist before. I mean, 700,000 dead Americans is a lot of people to process, and then you've got to take care of their wives. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole new apparatus that starts as a result of this. It's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, in fact, there's a whole book. It's one of the things that, and if you want to ask a question, feel free. Otherwise, I'll
go ahead.
there was, a lot of scholars, when they think about the Civil War, the big question is, why does this war start? Talking about the famous people like Abraham Lincoln, obviously the role of slavery. But there was a historian who's president of Harvard, and she wrote a book called This Republic of Suffering, where she basically said, look, all that stuff is happening, but the most important thing on most Americans' minds during the Civil War is death, because it's all around them. And it's challenging everything, like I said, from how do you get home and have a funeral, to how do you preserve a body, to are you a good Christian? Like, can a good Christian go out and be a part of killing 700,000 people? Like, everything in their worldview fell apart because of all of this death. And what's interesting is it's kind of like the coronavirus in that you get these pockets, because the way that the armies recruited or drafted back then was by county and cities. So you would raise up a regiment, but they would all be from the same, basically, town or neighborhood. So that if they went out into battle and there was a bad day and you lost 70% of them, it meant that town lost 70% of its young men. And so it would affect people in ways that may not affect another town, but certainly affected them. It's sort of like what we're seeing now. It's actually kind of similar.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you have so many people that are grieving the same type of loss, so many women and mothers and sisters and children, that how are you going to have people to take care of these people that are grieving when they're grieving themselves? It's just like a vicious cycle, all from the same place. And I don't know if this has to do with the Civil War. Maybe it was another war after that, but that they stopped sending siblings or brothers specifically, I guess, to battle.
Yeah, I think the famous example is World War II. Saving Private Ryan is based on that story. And there was a case I know in the Navy where the Sullivan brothers were, they had all died. And so, it's sort of a policy now. It's like, spread it out. Because there's the famous Bixby letter from Abraham Lincoln that people contest whether or not he actually wrote it. He probably did. But where the mother had 5 sons who all died. Now I think the military tries to spread it out. Hopefully, hopefully you don't experience that kind of casualty. But again, it also made sense based on how they recruited, that all 5 of those guys were probably in the same regiment, in the same battle,
right,
and all met the same fate. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It's something. But in some ways, it was empowering, because all those men gone meant that women all of a sudden had roles to perform that they hadn't performed before. They're the ones who had to run the farm or whatever. And then one thing I think is interesting too is it forced people who weren't on the battlefield to think about ways that they could contribute. Like, what do I do at the home front? I'm not out there dying, and that's the ultimate sacrifice for the country. So women sort of became thought of as the ones who were sacrificing their sons and husbands as martyrs for the country. And then you also had consumption. You could go out and you could buy, and it happens in World War I and World War II as well. Where it's like, hey, I'm being patriotic by spending money to buy a war bond or to send things to the troops. And it's sort of like what we have now, right? It's like, support your local business. Like, what can I do at home? Oh, you can support your local brewery. You can no, I'm serious. And it's
I love that's the first thing you go
the same thing. Right.
Masks, or you can go help out your elderly neighbor, pick up some
right.
You can support your brewery.
Support your local brewery. What I was like, oh, I'm so upset. I have to walk to the brewery and drag it home. Like, could have fought in the Battle of Gettysburg.
So what were they doing back then? So you're saying they're purchasing war bonds. What else are they doing to support?
Well, yeah, so that's more World War I and World War II. But yeah, during the Civil War, they're buying songs, so like music sheets. They're buying what were called cartes de visite, little basically little postcards that would have an image on it that you could then leave with someone if you went to visit them. Like a little calling card. They bought books, stories. They're basically consumers showing that they're patriots and that they're on the same side, which is interesting. And I know you want to talk about bathrooms. If you want to bring it up in the last 5 minutes, we can.
I absolutely do. So this has a lot to do. I have a fascination with this type of thing. So you have hundreds of thousands of men on the battlefield, and now we're talking about viruses and diseases and things like that are being spread. And obviously these are things that are spread through feces and obviously that sort of interaction. But so how does it work on the battlefield? What is
Great
this?
question. So unlike today's military that has a whole dedicated service to people who are the cooks and people who do drives, back then basically again regiments and units took care of their own stuff, so they were responsible for cooking their own food, doing their own laundry, digging their own latrine, and so basically it was really kind of haphazard, and they would sort of find ways to make it sanitary, but then what also they would do is they'd give it basically to the lowest common denominator, and oftentimes that was runaway slaves. So a lot of runaway slaves would join the Union Army and think, hey, I'm going to go fight. And then they would end up digging latrines, working the bathrooms, cleaning.
Getting the shit end of the stick, I guess.
Basically, right. And then where it gets even worse is in prisons. So the famous prison down in Andersonville was a Confederate prison for Union soldiers, is where you see this at its worst, where it's a confined space and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sick and injured prisoners in there. And there was one creek of fresh water, and that served as the bathroom and the laundry and the source of fresh water. And basically the soldiers created a hierarchy amongst themselves where the people who were the weakest and sickest, who we'd think would be taken care of and put far away, actually had to camp closest to it, because the idea was, well, number one, they can't really fight back and say no. And number two is they're going to die anyway. So the healthiest people stayed further away, and the poor bastard who had his legs blown off was sleeping next to the...
Up shit's creek, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Literally. Wow. Well, thankfully we have much better standards today, and I don't know how it works, but I don't know if it's a low man on the totem pole, or maybe they get paid more to be the sanitary guy. I don't know. Yeah,
right. I doubt it. It's probably some poor private who has to go take care of it.
The privates. Gimme. I was trying to talk about something else. I know we only have oh shoot, we have to go.
Oh my gosh, it's 4:30.
4:30.
Time flies when we're talking about the Civil War.
Next week we're gonna come on and we're gonna talk about, we have something very specific that we want. Oh, the story about the teacher, the Coronado teacher, and the students in the 1970s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That we give them a little teaser. It involves smuggling drugs through the Coronado swim and surf team.
In the 1970s, yeah. So that's something that Dave and I are going to research this week, and then come back next week and talk about it. So it should be pretty interesting. Yeah,
excellent. I look forward to it.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. This was a great first show with you, and thank you for all of your knowledge. And we will see you next week.
Sounds good.
Okay. Bye.